at all. What you need to do, there's only two things you need to do to feel fear. One, put yourself in a situation where you are afraid. Two, allow yourself to feel the terror itself. Allow yourself to feel it as a feeling. That's the only two things you need to do with fear. It's really simple dealing with fear, but you try doing it. It's really hard when you try doing it because most people start feeling the fear and then they'd want to do anything other than that, anything. And, people will do all sorts of things just to stay away from fear. They'll even murder to stay away from fear. Why do you think there's around 50 million abortions every year around the world? Because there's 50 million women and men who want to avoid certain fears. And they're willing to murder children to avoid those fears. Like, as a society, we're willing to do so many things just to avoid a fear. And there's only we only have to do two things. One, place ourselves in a situation where the fear is triggered. Two, allow ourselves to feel the fear. We don't have to take any other action, but most people don't do that. Most people take an action to help their fear go away. Yeah. And we will do, like mankind historically has done terrible things to avoid fear. Terrible things. We're even willing to create an arsenal of nuclear weapons to avoid fear that's so big that if it was all unleashed at one time, it would completely destroy humanity. That's how willing we're able to go to avoid the fear of security, for example, personal security. Like, that's, if you look at all of the things that are created on the earth that we're all... And ironically, it heightens their fear. Now everyone's afraid somebody's going to push the button, sort of thing, like, well, don't create the weapon in the first place. That would surely be the best answer, but unfortunately that's what we do because we're already afraid and we don't want to acknowledge it and we don't want to feel it. And so what we do is we project it and we create circumstances around us that cause our fear, in fact, to increase in most cases. And that's the law of attraction in work. Yeah. But fear is one of the biggest emotions that each person on the planet will have to, at some point, choose to feel rather than choose to avoid. Yeah. And most of us don't. We choose to avoid, manipulate it, get away from it, do something to maneuver around it. That's what we do with our fear. So all of your anger, pretty much all of your anger, is caused by fear. Now that's a well-recognised psychological fact, actually. Most psychologists would say to you that all of your anger is caused by fear. Of course, they draw the line at some things, like they draw the line at fear of death. That to them is a justified fear, and to me it's not. There's no such thing as death anyway. You live forever, so whether you live here in a physical body or live in a spirit body, it doesn't really matter. You're living forever. So to me, there is no justification of doing something even when you're faced with death. But the average person on the planet who doesn't believe those things will go, no, there are certain times when your fear is justified. And everyone on the planet has some justification of the fear that exists inside of themselves, where they don't want to feel it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And particularly the justification of fear of death. Most people are very, very afraid of death at all sorts of levels.
Or the death of a loved one.
Yeah, the break, in particular, death usually causes for most people what they perceive as the breakage of a relationship that they want to hold on to of some kind, or a breakage of the relationship with Earth, or a breakage of their ability to use their body in ways that they'd like to use it. They feel that that's not going to be possible. And so they have all sorts of fears that govern why they will prevent death at all costs, prevent their own death, I mean. And they're willing to shoot another person, in other words, kill another person to prevent their own death. And that's fear that causes us to do that. If we're not in a state of fear, we don't feel that way. We would never be willing to shoot another person or harm another person just to prevent our own death. Yeah. But see, these are all things that are justified on the planet at the moment. And so if you allow yourself to feel it, the world around you justifies a certain level of fear. You know, if you read any psychologist manuals or books, you'll find that there's a justification of certain types of fear when it comes to self-preservation. There's a justification of all sorts of fears. So while psychologists acknowledge that anger is created by the denial of fears and the lack of acceptance of the emotion of fear, they also support that in certain circumstances. And that might be, they support it in the circumstance where your own life is threatened, for example. And so many psychologists, of course, would support war rather than saying that war is unnecessary. And it's all because of fear in the end. Yeah. Fear is the work you're going to have to do at some point. In fact, it's going to be the main work you have to do. Because if you had no fears right now and you really had a desire for God right now, what would happen? You'd already be at one with God. Does that make sense? You'd already be at one with God. If you had no fear and a desire to have received God's love, you would have already received God's love right to the point of at one with God. It's only your fear that prevents it. So it's always fear that you've got to do most work with. And that applies to me as well as yourself.